to go through the entire book of Obadiah because it's such a short book. And we're going to go through it together at the first part of this sermon, and it might feel like the sermon's a little dry. So I want to promise you, if you can make it through Obadiah with me, I want to promise you some good things. I'm going to give you my outline for a sermon. We're going to give the historical context of Obadiah, then we'll do the entire book of Obadiah, then we'll do the thesis of Obadiah, and then we're going to tell a story where I'm the bad guy, because you all like those way better than the ones I'm the good guy, right? No, just me? Okay. And then I'm going to show you a picture of a cute dog. All right, and then I'll talk about In-N-Out burger cups, and then we'll wrap it up by saying, so what does this all mean for us today? Does that sound good to you this morning? All right, so let's dive in. Stay with me, and that picture of a cute dog will show up soon, I promise. Okay, we're going to go to Dr. Julia M. O'Brien, who talks about the book of Obadiah. Now, there are several Obadiahs in Scripture, but Dr. O'Brien says that this one is not connected to any of them. She writes, despite our lack of information about this particular Obadiah, his family background, or when he lived, most interpreters link the contents of the book to the events in the 6th century BCE. So, this is important for us to know because we do not know exactly when Obadiah wrote these words that we're about to read. But most scholars, most interpreters, she say, link it to what happened in the 6th century BCE, which was the most influential historical event in all of the Hebrew Bible. If you're not sure what it was, let's go back 2,600 years ago to the capital of a nation named Judah. This capital was named Jerusalem. And this is a very short version of this story, but in 586 BCE, an empire from the east known as Babylon launched an assault on Jerusalem, destroyed the city, and took the survivors back with them to Babylon to live in exile. Their whole plan was to take the survivors and assimilate them into Babylonian culture, and that way they would have more Babylonian soldiers to fight more wars for their growing empire. This lasted for 47 years, and it is known as a period in Jewish history as the exile. Let me hear you say exile this morning. Now, it's one thing to hear this story and look at a map. It's another thing to feel this story, which is why we have art pieces that describe what this story was like. Imagine that your home got leveled by an army, and then that army rips you out of where you want to live and forces you to live among them, where they are telling you that you and your people group and your way of life will eventually die out and serve their empire. This is the emotion you have to hold close to your vest, hold close to your heart as you read the book of Obadiah. And we're not sure how much longer after the exile happened, or if it was even written during the exile, but Obadiah's emotion taps into that part of Jewish history. So, we are going to go through the entire book of Obadiah. The best way to study the Bible, in my opinion, is to look at all of the different verses and try and group them together, create an outline so that way you can look at this whole book from an aerial point of view and start to understand what the thesis of this letter would be, because the thesis is the most important part. The reason Obadiah wrote this prophecy is what we're after. So, let's turn to Obadiah chapter 1, verse 1, where we read, "The vision of Obadiah, I received a message," he writes, "from sovereign Yahweh, a.k.a. the creator of the world." It's here that we should say, stop. Whoa. Really, Obadiah? You think that you received a vision personally from God? And while we read about these things in the Bible, and if you grew up in the church, you have a feeling that this is just taken for granted, that God speaks to people in the Bible all the time. If you didn't grow up in church, you may hear this and think to yourself, what makes Obadiah so special? And a question that you may ask is a very fair question, which is, did the Almighty Creator literally and historically and verbally speak to Obadiah? And while it would be nice to find some archaeological discovery that could prove or debunk that idea, there is no archaeological discovery that could verify this. So the answer really is, it's up to the reader to decide. The reader has to decide whether or not Obadiah is receiving this vision from God. Is this an idea that Obadiah is about to share that will take us backwards? Or is Obadiah about to share an idea that will take us so far forwards, it's so progressive, that it's possible, if not literal, that the divine inspired it? So you can read through this book with me, saying to yourself, I wonder if God actually spoke to Obadiah. Now, this raises another question we need to ask when Obadiah claims that God spoke to him directly. The question we should ask is, did Obadiah literally and historically believe that God spoke to him? I can say with great certainty that this almost certainly happened. If we had Obadiah here today, no matter what it is that actually happened, I have no doubt that Obadiah would say, God spoke to me. I don't think he's manipulative. I don't think he's lying. I may disagree with his conclusion, but Obadiah would be convicted that he's heard the voice of God, and that's why he wrote. Which raises one other question that we should ask before we go further in Obadiah, which is, does Obadiah's prophecy still have value if God never spoke to him? And I will tell you, this is our second time through the entire Bible, and there are lots of books of the Bible where I'm convinced God didn't speak to the person who was claiming God spoke to them, and I have found that in every book of the Bible, there is always value. So I answer this with absolutely. Even if God never spoke to Obadiah, and Obadiah made the whole thing up, I believe there's still value in studying it today. So with that, let's return back and read about this message that Obadiah received from Yahweh. Obadiah continues by saying, a messenger was sent among the nations saying, rise up, let us march against them, being Edom, in battle. Thus says God concerning Edom. So, verse 1 is very simply an introduction that establishes authority. Obadiah says to whoever's reading this prophecy, you need to listen to me because the almighty creator of the universe spoke to me. So, Obadiah is establishing authority right off the bat. Now, Obadiah also assumes that you and I as readers know what Edom is. But if you're like me, you actually have to look up what Edom is to understand who they were, where they were, and what their motivations were. So if we look at Jerusalem, which is the capital city of Obadiah's nation, which is Judah, there is a neighboring nation to the south known as the nation of Edom. And Edom was in intense rivalries and wars with Jerusalem because they were so close together. And so Obadiah says, hey, God's told me something about the people who live to the south, you know, the ones who kill us sometime and go to war with us sometime. We then return back to Obadiah's writing, and this is what God says about the nation of Edom. I will diminish you among the nations. You will be utterly despised. So this starts another section of the book in which Obadiah says that God claims that judgment will be coming for these guys. Judgment is coming, and while Edom may look happy now, Obadiah says, they're eventually going to get their own. Obadiah continues, he says, your arrogant heart has led you astray, you who live in mountain clefts, whose home is in the heights. You say in your heart, who is able to bring me down to the ground? If you know the geography of Israel, you know the southern region is more hilly and mountainous, and this is Mount Seir, and this is where the Edomites used to live. They lived up high, while the people of Jerusalem and Judah lived down low. So they said, you think you're special living up there? Well, you will be brought low one day, Obadiah says. Obadiah continues, though you soared like the eagle and built your nest among the stars, I will still fling you down again. It is Yahweh who speaks, and Yahweh is quite a poet, might I add. He goes on to say, if thieves came to rob you or intruders came during the night, they would steal only as much as they needed. I think Obadiah is trying to do a sick burn here, but I cannot understand why this is a burn. He's like, you think you're special? Well, just wait till the thieves come and they only take what they need. It's like, okay. Obadiah attempts another sick burn in the next verse when he says, and if grape gatherers came to your fields, they would still leave some gleanings for you. That's how completely you'll be destroyed. This was the welfare system of Obadiah's day, and the fact that farmers would leave some behind for those impoverished. So I think Obadiah is trying to say to the Edomites that God will leave you so decimated you will all live in poverty. Obadiah continues, and how Esau has been plundered, their hidden treasures ransacked. And Esau is a name that Obadiah assumes you and I know. Now, if you grew up in church school like me, you know the story of Jacob and Esau. But let's refresh ourselves just a bit to remind ourselves what this story was. A long time ago, about 1,000 years before the Babylonian exile occurred, there were two twins who were born to a man named Isaac and a woman named Rebekah. These twins were Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau was the older twin, and Jacob was the younger twin. And this was a big deal in Jacob and Esau's day because the older son got the lion's share of the inheritance, while the younger son would end up frequently working for or serving the eldest son. So Jacob did not like this arrangement, being the younger of two twin brothers. So he came up with a plan. One day, while Esau was out hunting, he created a delicious stew and began to wait till Esau would return from the hunt. Well, eventually, after many hours, Esau returned back home, and he smelt that stew that Jacob was putting together. He was so overwhelmed with hunger that Esau said, "I will give you anything to have a bowl of your stew." And Jacob, stirring the pot quite literally and metaphorically, says to him, "How about you give me your birthright, and I will give you a bowl of stew?" Esau is so hungry, he says, "Sure." He takes the bowl of stew, and Jacob smiles, knowing that what was not supposed to be his now belongs to him. Now, a few chapters later, it becomes apparent that Isaac was never aware of this deal, because Isaac, their father, is about to die, and he says, "It's time for me to give the inheritance to my oldest son, Esau." So Isaac, who is nearly blind, calls Esau to his bedside and says, "Esau, I want you to go out and hunt and capture game and prepare a meal, and over a meal, I will bless you and give you your inheritance." So Esau leaves. Jacob overhears this and decides he's going to trick his father. He dresses up like Esau, he prepares a meal, and he enters his father's tent. And his father, who is visually impaired, says to him, "Who's there?" And Jacob, dressed up as Esau, says, "It is I, Esau." He then lies to his father over and over again until his father says, "Come closer." And with a bit of a dubious tone, his father Isaac decides to bless him and give him Esau's inheritance. Jacob then gets out of there. Esau returns. Esau is upset. So upset, he says, "Once my dad dies, I will murder my brother Jacob." This understandably scares Jacob, and he leaves quickly from his hometown. He goes into the wilderness, and he lives there for 1 decade, 2 decades. He builds a family, and then he returns several decades later, and he is worried that Esau, the person who he stole from and tricked, will still want to murder him. So Jacob returns. He bows low before Esau, and Esau pushes the bow aside and instead pulls him up and embraces him and forgives him. Now, the reason this story matters when we talk about Obadiah is because the way the culture was in Obadiah's day is they believed that Jacob's descendants became all the people of Judah, and Esau's descendants became the Edomites. And so when Obadiah writes, "and how Esau has been plundered," he's really saying, "and how the house of Esau," or Edom, has been plundered. Their hidden treasures ransacked. And so he's talking about this whole story that is part of their history and their understanding of how they are separate and different. And you can imagine through all of that conflict from generation to generation, this story embodies so much of how they related to one another. Obadiah continues by saying, "All your allies, Edom, will drive you back to the borders of your land. Your fine friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who ate your bread will set traps for you. They'll say, 'Where is your wisdom now?' When that day arrives, it is Yahweh who speaks. I will remove the sages from Edom and leave no wisdom on Esau's mountain. Your warriors, O Teman, which is a city in Edom, will lose their courage, and no one will survive on Esau's mountain." So, this is the second section of Obadiah's prophecy, verse 2-9, in which Obadiah says to Edom, judgment is coming, and it's not going to be pretty. Then in verse 10, a new section begins. Obadiah writes, "For the outrage done to Jacob, aka my nation of Judah, your sibling, you will be swallowed up in disgrace, and you will vanish forever." This new section is all about why Edom deserves this judgment from God. Obadiah says, "Let me remind you of all the things you've done, Edom," and he goes on a rant. He says, "On that day you stood there aloof while strangers carried off Jacob's wealth. When foreigners passed through the gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you behaved like the rest of them." What day is he talking about? The day when Babylon attacked Jerusalem. On that day, Obadiah says, you, Edom, our distant ancestors, stood by and did nothing. Obadiah continues, how could you gloat over your sisters and brothers on the day of their tribulation? How could you exult over the children of Judah on the day of their devastation? How could you heckle them so loudly on the day of their anguish? How could you march through the gate of my people on their day of destruction, or join in the gloating when disaster overtook them, or pillage their treasures on the day of their heartbreak? How could you, Edom, stand at the crossroads to slay people while they were escaping? Obadiah believes that the people of Edom killed people as they were trying to escape the Babylonian conquest, which is a pretty big accusation. He goes on to say, how could you betray the survivors on the day of their anguish? These 5 verses here, tell us the story about how Edom deserves the judgment that God is going to bring. Then in verse 15, Obadiah names this judgment and how it's going to happen. He says, as you have done, so will it be done to you. Your deeds will recoil on your own head. The day of Yahweh is near for all the nations. He calls this the day of Yahweh, and it's important for the people hearing this prophecy to note that the day of Yahweh will come, and on that day, there will be no grace given whatsoever. Then in verse 16, the last section of the book of Obadiah begins, in which Obadiah writes, you will drink that cup on my holy mountain, and all the nations will drink from it in turn. In other words, this section is all about how not just Edom, but all of you, you're all going to die, and my people, Judah, are going to thrive. He goes on to write, but a remnant will survive on Mount Zion, and it will be a holy remnant. The house of Jacob will dispossess those who had dispossessed them. The house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a blaze, and the house of Esau will be stubble. In other words, Obadiah looks up at those hills where the Edomites are and says, hey, those hills will be lit up with fire one day, and everyone from Edom, he says, will perish. He says they will set it on fire and burn it down, and no member of the house of Esau will survive. It is Yahweh God who speaks. And they will occupy the Negev and the Mount of Esau, as well as Shephelah and Philistia. They will occupy the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria, Benjamin, along with Gilead. The exiles from this army, the warriors of Israel, will occupy the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath. And the exiles from Jerusalem, now in Sepharad, will occupy the towns of the Negev. Victorious, they will climb Mount Zion and judge the Mount of Esau, and the sovereignty will belong to Yahweh. And with those words, the book of Obadiah is brought to a close. So, we have Obadiah today. And when you're looking at this outline, and when we go through the entire book, the question becomes, what is the thesis of the book of Obadiah? What's his main point? And for me, the thesis of Obadiah is very simple. It's God hates you, God loves us, and God will demonstrate that love by your nation's imminent destruction. And if you're like me, you hear this thesis, you read through this book, and your reaction is this. Okay, great, wow. Would you come up with that on your own, Obadiah? And the reason we yawn and kind of roll our eyes and kind of tune it out is because we all know something intuitively as human beings, which is if God's list of enemies is identical to your list of enemies, then you need to reevaluate your understanding of God, right? If it's all the same, you need to reevaluate your understanding of God. And Obadiah says, all my enemies will die because God wants them to. That's the end. So, we look at this story and we asked a question. Did the Almighty Creator literally and historically speak to Obadiah? The answer we came up with is, it's up to the reader to decide. For me personally, I don't think so. I personally don't feel like God spoke to Obadiah and said, I hate the Edomites, I can't wait to light their hills on fire and kill them all. That doesn't sound like the God I know. Now, you may feel that God literally and historically spoke to Obadiah. More than fine. We can continue the conversation from there. But for me, it helps me to better understand the story of Obadiah when I make peace with this. Now, I don't think Obadiah tricked everyone. I think Obadiah really believed that's what God wanted. But I personally don't think that God literally and historically spoke to Obadiah. I would categorize this book of the Bible as a difficult book of the Bible. And whenever we encounter a difficult book of the Bible, you can always find value in them. And the best way I've found to help us find value in these books is a bit of a three-step process. It begins by saying, let's assume the worst about Obadiah, then let's assume the best about Obadiah, and then let's just consider the impact of Obadiah in 2024. So let's begin with assuming the worst about Obadiah. And for that, I want to tell you a story about how I was a bad guy. My wife and I have been married for 14 years. This is a real story that took place a few years ago, several years ago, in fact. And we have some couple friends. This is not their real name, but we have friends. We'll call them John and Mary. Now, John and Mary have always treated us with respect and kindness and love. And one day, Kimmy was out and about, and she coincidentally ran into our friend. This is not her real name either. We'll call her Ruth. And said hi to Ruth, and Ruth said, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" And then they started catching up, and they started talking about things. And Ruth said to Kimmy eventually, "Oh, you would not believe what Evelyn told me." Now, it's important at this point in the story to tell you, we have never met Evelyn. But Evelyn said to Ruth, who said to Kimmy, "Hey, did you hear about John and Mary? John is sleeping around, and Mary has no idea." So that story went from Evelyn to Ruth, then to Kimmy, who came home and said, "Craig, you wouldn't believe what happened. I heard that John is being unfaithful to Mary." Now, we talked about it for some time, and eventually we decided together that we weren't going to believe it. We don't even know who Evelyn is. We don't know if she's a credible source. It's not really any of our business, but we both decided together, this doesn't sound like the John we know, and we're not going to believe it. And so we didn't, until we were invited over to lunch one day. And this lunch took place after church. John and Mary go to separate church from us. They invited us over, and we went over to their place together as a family. And when we arrived, only Mary was there. And Kimmy very casually said, "Where's John?" And Mary said, "Oh, John will be here any minute. He's just out with some friends." Now, Kimmy and I cannot talk about this at the same time in front of Mary, right? But later, when we were talking after all this happened, we found out we were thinking the exact same thing, which was, "Sure you are, John, hanging out with your friends." And so we just sat there and waited for John to return from hanging out with his friends. And the whole time, just massive amount of judgment for me, right? Just the worst kind of judgment. And eventually, 15 or 30 minutes later, John comes in with a big smile on his face, and he says, "Hey, Craig and Kimmy, how are you?" He welcomes us, gives us a hug, and then we sit down for lunch, and as we're sitting there, he eventually says, "Oh, I just had the best time hanging out with my friends." And I just kind of hold my fork. I'm shaking a little bit. And I said, "Oh, really? What did you do with your friends?" He's like, "Oh, we looked at airplanes together." And I said, "Really, what kind?" He's like, "Well, let me show you." And he pulls out a phone, and there's a video of him dressed in the same clothes, hanging out at a plane with his friends. Immediately, I thought to myself, oh my gosh. I told myself I would not believe this, and I wholeheartedly believed it. I point this out because we must never underestimate the power of a narrative to shape our understanding of another human being. And even if you think, oh, it doesn't affect me, or I'm consciously not going to do this, this story taught me I am still victim to it. A narrative will stick in your mind like Velcro and shape a lot of the ways you perceive people who are not like you. So, we have this story about two twin brothers in which Jacob's descendants became the Judahites and Esau's descendants became the Edomites. We found the Edomites' archaeological ruins. And while we have not found much writing from them, we have a lot of writings from the Judahites. That's what became the Bible. It's important to know that as far as we know, only the Judahites told the story of Jacob and Esau. We can't find anything in which the Edomites are like, oh, our distant ancestor Esau, who we love. All we know is that the Judahites were telling each other this story about these two brothers, one of which stepped in front of line and took the inheritance that belonged to the other. And when you consider the story from that perspective, you have to remember that this story existed as oral tradition, and it's highly unlikely that the story of Jacob and Esau is historical, because it lasted for 1,000 years as oral tradition, which raises the question, where did this story come from? Well, you can imagine that one day, people were sitting around a campfire in Judah, and one of the kids asked their parents, they knew that they didn't like the Edomites, and the kid said, "What's the deal with the Edomites?" And it's here that maybe there was some acknowledgement of common ancestry, but a story came to the front where there was all of a sudden twin brothers, and there was some trickery and some deception and some threats of murder. And this came forward, and it started to get passed down from generation to generation, and until it was finally written down sometime between the 6th and 9th century BCE. Now, I point this out because when you look at the story of Jacob, what happens with this stew, right? Well, in this story, Jacob is the one who is cunning and wise and opportunistic, right? Esau, meanwhile, is rash, impulsive, and dumb. And when you consider that story in the context of the history with these two rival nations, the question becomes, are we talking about two individuals or two different nations? Are the people of Judah cunning, wise, and opportunistic, and the people of Esau rash, impulsive, and dumb? Well, if you read the writings of Obadiah, it translates centuries later. Think about this story where Jacob steps in front of the line and takes the blessing from Esau. Well, what does this communicate about Jacob? Cunning, wise, opportunistic. Esau misses out because he took too long on the hunt, which he was really good at, but he really missed his target on this point. Well, what does that tell us about Esau? He's a dumb jock. And that question then, or that point, really helps us to realize that we're not talking about two individuals, we're talking about two different nations. And if you read through the prophets, this story is referenced over and over and over again by all sorts of prophets from different eras, from Ezekiel to Isaiah to Joel to Jeremiah. These prophets constantly said, "Oh, Edom, how terrible you are in the eyes of the Lord. Your destruction is coming soon." So, let's assume the worst about Obadiah. Let's just assume that Obadiah is a racist liar who fabricated a vision from God to justify his hatred of a specific people group. The book is still worth studying because it holds up a mirror to all of us and it challenges us. Obadiah challenges all of us to examine the narratives we tell each other about the people who are not like us. Obadiah is the one that steps up and says, are you really telling stories that are honest or just advancing what you want to find? Think about the stories we tell in this nation about undocumented immigrants, right? Think about how we sometimes highlight the absolute worst of this group and say, see, this is how they all are, even though we know full well that's not who they are. This shapes a narrative, and immigration was one of the biggest issues in selecting this president. Is this a story in which we are telling a narrative that affirms their humanity, or a story that further entrenches us in our divisions? Think about the narratives you hear about trans people today, and whether or not trans people are made in the image of God. And while some people may highlight trans people at their worst, the idea that you would go to trans people and say, tell me who your worst people are because they speak for the whole group, is awful. We do not judge groups based on their worst people. And when it comes to trans people, the narratives that are going around are just frankly ridiculous and harmful and hurtful. When I think about this election and the narratives that we tell each other about people who are not like us, it is worth examining whether those stories are real and accurate or if they're just furthering what you want to hear, further telling you that you're good and they're bad. When I think of men and who I've hung out with, the question I have to ask us is, what are the stories we are telling each other about women and what women want and what their goals and their dreams are? And I would ask the women here today to think the same about how they talk about men and the stories they tell about men and what men want. Are you judging men based on the worst of the group, or are you judging men on the whole of the group? And I think about our personal enemies and the people we have real conflict with. I'll tell you, I have some enemies. I know you do too. And they're hard to forgive. They're hard to reconcile. They're hard to learn how to love. But one of the main ways we learn how to love them is by the stories we tell about them when they're not around. And this isn't to excuse their behavior or to say anything that's not true, as much as to find some shred of empathy. And Obadiah dares to ask us the question, what stories are you telling about your enemies? And can you listen to new stories that would bring about empathy? And can you begin to tell the stories that affirm the image of God in them? Obadiah challenges us to look at our stories. And I would encourage all of us to think about the stories we tell and the stories we listen to. Which moves us from the worst about Obadiah to the best. Now, Obadiah, we are studying today because it was voted a long time ago to be part of the Hebrew Bible, and then later voted in as part of the Christian Bible. And we print Bibles and we talk about all the contents here today in church in 2024. We still use an adjective to describe the Bible, which is holy, that which is divinely inspired or set apart for God. And so the word holy applies not just to some books of the Bible, but all of the Bible. And what's fascinating about Obadiah, and the reason we read it all together, is so that you know what I know, which is there is nothing redeeming in Obadiah. It would be so nice if it would end by saying but God has challenged me to learn how to love them. But there's nothing like that, right? There's nothing that says, well, forgiveness is the key. It's not in there. Obadiah makes no point. Obadiah is like, I hate the Edomites, and so does God. And yet we describe that as holy, which means that his lamentation, his profound expression of grief, is also considered holy. This is great news for all of us. You know why? Have you ever been so mad at someone that you have ranted and raved and said, I'm sure God hates them too? Your lament is holy as well. And when you don't make a spiritual point from your anger, it's fine. Maybe that's not the point of it. It's still holy. This week, I had the privilege of getting coffee with one of our own here at Paradox. She's a practicing psychotherapist. Her name is Becky Galvez, and I really enjoyed getting to know her over coffee. When we started to talk, she, of course, told me about her pride and joy, which is her dog, Misky, who sometimes wears bow ties, which is just adorable. And after we had finished talking about dogs, we started talking about enemies and forgiveness and making sense of this polarization. And from her experience as a psychotherapist, she told me this when it comes to patients and their relationship with forgiveness. She said, when a new client comes in and right away says, I have an enemy and I want to forgive them, it's a yellow flag for me. Yellow because it's good intentions, but we need to proceed with caution, she says. She goes on to say, forgiveness can be misused as a way to avoid addressing our tough emotions and trauma, and avoiding these feelings can cause them to come out in ugly ways and prevent longer change from happening. The only way through your anger, out of your anger, is through it. And when we consider the fact that this Holy Bible contains a lament with no redeeming value, it is good news for all of us because it reminds us that our lament is holy. As a Christian, has an auntie or a mom or a cousin ever sent you Bible verse after Bible verse saying you need to forgive, you need to be less angry, you need to be kinder? If they do, send them back the book of Obadiah. And remind them that this is just as holy as any of those verses saying we need to love our enemies. Which moves us from the best about Obadiah to the impact of Obadiah. Now, are there any fans of the restaurant In-N-Out Burger here this morning? Yeah, I'm a vegetarian and I love In-N-Out Burger, so that's how good it is. Now, I don't know if you know this, but if you look in very specific places on all their paper products, there is a Bible verse. On the inside of their soda cup, there is John 3:16, which talks about how God loved the world. On the milkshake cup, it's Proverbs 3:5, which I think is funny. You get different verses based on your caloric intake. And if you get the fries, then you'll get Proverbs 24:16. And these verses talk about trusting in God and that God loves the world and that God has things in control. You know what's on none of their paper products? A verse from Obadiah. Imagine you flip over the fry basket and it says Obadiah 1:7, and you look it up and it says, your fine friends will deceive and overpower you. Those who ate your bread will set traps for you. And you're looking around your friends like, why did I invite these people? None of this works for Obadiah. And I will tell you, I grew up in the church. A lot of people here grew up in the church. I cannot remember one sermon preached on Obadiah, and I can't remember anyone ever saying, well, you know what Obadiah says about a situation like this? I have no memory of it. It's possible it happened. I can't remember any of it. This is worth remembering because your laments are holy. Your laments are necessary, but consider the impact of our laments. We sometimes trick ourselves into thinking that our laments are our story, that our laments are the work that we're supposed to do. But when we consider that no one quotes Obadiah, even though it's necessary and holy, we realize that laments rarely inspire. It's the steps after lament are what inspires. It doesn't mean that lament isn't important, but if your life is just filled with complaints about something, I think that Jesus Christ would say to you, you're missing the point. The point is love, and love causes us to grieve and lament, but the point is love and not complaints. It's not love. It's not anger. When I consider this Obadiah person who we know very little about, we only have 21 verses about him, and they're all angry. I hope Obadiah was able to honestly lament this way, and then he put down his pen and went about his life filled with love. It would be sad to me if I found out that Obadiah had his first kiss, and as he's kissing this first woman he loves, he says, oh, I hate those Edomites. It would be tragic to me if he's walking his daughter down the aisle at her wedding and thinking to himself, this is what the Edomites are trying to destroy. It's like, golly, give it a rest, man. And I point that out because laments are necessary, they're holy, but even if you're on the holy path, if you are not careful, your life can be defined by bitterness. And it's possible that Obadiah was like this his whole life and just angry and vile toward the Edomites. There is more to life than that. There is more love to life than that. And bitterness is a choice. And love is also a choice. And so Obadiah invites all of us into love. My friends, may you lament honestly and trust that your lament is holy. May you honestly examine the stories of others in your life. May you honestly examine the stories of others in your life. That's twice. We'll go with the fourth one here, which is, may your life be defined by love rather than bitterness, and may you see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, including the books of the Bible that are difficult. Amen.